We pick up this slideshow in Athens in the 6th century BC. During this time, as you've seen in an earlier presentation, Athens had a fairly simple but intricate social organisation. It was made up at its lowest level of many oikoi or households. These oikoi each belonged to clans or gens. The gens then belonged to phratries or brotherhoods, and the brotherhoods or phratries were broken up again into tribes or phyli. All of these groups were dominated by the wealthy, old money families of Athens, the eupatridoi. As a consequence of this social system, and also of the poor quality land in Athens, the city was rife with social inequality, with poverty, and infighting between the wealthy families, and great factionalism between the tribes. Social tension at this time rose to a point where the peace of the city was seriously threatened. The ruling families therefore recognised that finally something had to be done, and they finally called for one of their own to devise a solution. They called upon this man, Solon. Solon is known as one of the 7 sages or wise men of ancient Greece, and tradition has it that the job of fixing Athens' problems fell to him sometime around the year 594 BCE, although some sources say that it's anything as late as 574 BCE. He had a pretty big task ahead of him, one which was virtually guaranteed not to satisfy people. He had to preserve the privileges of the rich. He had to satisfy the needs of the poor, who wanted the land to be redistributed. He had to ensure the protection of the city, and he needed to build a sense of good order, or eunomia. Solon's first task was to recognise that many of the poorer people in ancient Greece had got themselves into significant issues with debt. The debt in this time, as we've talked about earlier, was identified by a series of marker stones on their land called the horoi, as is shown in this picture. The horoi indicated that the person in question had basically traded off 1/6 of their income forever to a debtor in return for not paying off a debt. This was a pretty big deal, and many people were very resentful of this problem. Solon recognized this and realized that to make the poor happy, he was going to need to get rid of these burdens, and so he undertook what was called the Sisakthia, or the shaking off of burdens. So during this, he went around and he and his officials took away the horoi stones from the farms that showed that a particular person was in debt and cleared them. This basically ensured that those people had a clean slate, and obviously many of the poor were very happy. The rich, not so much. Solon also realised that the law code in Athens was a little bit of a mess. The last time it had been touched was a quarter of a century earlier, when a fairly serious sort of fellow, Draco, had codified the law. Now, whilst Draco's law code meant equality for all before the law, his law code also involved a fairly obvious pattern of death penalty for virtually everything. Solon minimised this and changed the death penalty only to the most serious of crimes. He's shown here in this fairly fanciful picture, dictating new laws to a series of scribes. One of the biggest problems that he encountered was the issue of debt slavery. Debt slavery has been discussed earlier when we talked about the Sisakthia, but it was also possible for people to actually go one step further. They didn't just have to mortgage their land. Sometimes people mortgaged themselves or even their family as surety against the debt. Obviously, the problem came about not when the loan was repaid, but if it wasn't repaid. What it meant was that literally the poor were going into slavery for the rich because of the fact they'd run into debt. This caused massive social problems in Athens and obviously huge resentment. As a consequence, Solon outlawed this process and abolished the practice of debt slavery. In Athens, we have seen earlier on that there was a traditional class structure. At the top were the old money families, the eupatrids. Beneath them, the georgioi, or the middle-class farmers. The artisans, craftsmen, and city workers were the demiurgoi, and at the bottom were the thetes. There was also a subclass of people taken out of the Georgioi, who were called the Hectomoroi. These people experienced social disgrace because they had got themselves into debt and were not able to get out of it. As a consequence, whilst they would have once been Georgioi, they now owed 1/6 part of their produce to one of the upper classes. As a consequence, they were known as the Hectomoroi, or the Six-Parters. Solon took it upon himself to systematically dismantle the system. He believed that the Eupatrids had had too much control for too long, and believed that it was important for people to have a chance to actually move into that social class. So this old system was dismantled, and he replaced it with something else. This new system would be a society where your class was dictated by your wealth. This is called a timocracy, Timocracy. In his timocracy, the top class was a group called the Pentacosiomedimnoi. The Pentacosiomedimnoi were able to produce the equivalent of 500 bushels of grain, or its equivalent, per year. This meant they were very wealthy people who probably owned large farms. Typically, all of the Eupatrids entered this group, but others who had become wealthy over time could also enter it. The next group was called the Hippias. The Hippias produced 300 bushels of grain, or its equivalent, per year. The Zugatai were the next group down, and they produced 200 bushels of grain, or its equivalent, per year. And the lowest class remained, the Thetes. They produced less than 200 bushels of grain per year, and were significantly the poorest group. There was a big significance of this system, because in the previous system, aristocracy, you were born into position. If you were a member of the Eupatridoi, you remained a member of the Eupatridoi. If you were a member of the Georgioi, you remained a member of the Georgioi. There was no moving up and there was no moving down. That's where you stayed. In Solon's system, if this person was born a member of the Zugatai and worked hard and was able to increase his level of production, he could move himself up to the Hippias class. There was also another significance in this system. The Hippias, being wealthy, usually had large amounts of land and were able to provide for themselves a horse. Now this might seem a silly thing, but in the ancient armies, a cavalry horse was seen as a valuable commodity, and the Hippias were rich enough to be able to afford the horse and to be able to armour themselves as well. The Zugatai, being not quite as wealthy, couldn't afford the horse, but they were able to outfit themselves as a hoplite, that is, one of the Greek soldiers which were the backbone of the Athenian army. Therefore they were seen as being valuable to the Athenian cause. Also, obviously, at this time, the Athenians and many other Greek city-states fought a great number of battles and wars against one another, so the army was very important. At the top of the pile were the Pentacosiomedimni. These people ended up being the commanders of the army for a couple of reasons, mainly because they were rich and they could afford to outfit an army. Basically, this meant that if Thetes needed an armour, the Pentacosiomedimnoi could provide it, and that would guarantee that they got the honour of leading armies. They were sometimes also called on to outfit triremes, that is the Greek ships, and to perform other significant duties. It's clear that people actually saw this as a really good system in that they could move up and down, and there is record in Aristotle of this guy called Athemion, the son of Diphilius, who set up a dedication to the gods in the Agora when he exchanged his ranking in the labourer class, or the Zugatai, for one in the horseman class, the Hippias. So Athemion was clearly proud enough of this achievement that he was willing to fork out his hard-earned cash and to erect a statue in the Agora. Solon also made significant constitutional changes. He decided that it was time to introduce a body to oversee the running of government, and this would be called the Boule, or the Council of 400. The Council of 400 would be represent the various ancient tribes of Athens, the Geliontes, the Hoplites, the Argedaeus, and the Aegicorius. Each one of these would send 100 men. These would be chosen by lot from amongst their tribes, and they would serve on the Boule. The Boule's function was to oversee the operations of the Ecclesia, or the Assembly of Athens. They would suggest topics of conversation, and they would basically prepare the running sheet. So what we ended up with was a structure where if you were in the wealthiest class, you were able to be involved in all levels of government. So this was a much more democratic system in that a lot more people were able to be involved, and basically anyone could potentially be involved as long as they could move up into the classes. The Pentecosio were able to be part of the archonship, so they could be one of the 9 archons of Athens. They could therefore also enter the Areopagus, or the Council of Elders. They were entitled to be a part of the Boule. They could perform one of the lower state offices. They could also become part of the Ecclesia. The next lower classes, the Hippias and Zugatai, could become part of the Boule, the lower state offices in the Ecclesia. And the Thetes, being of the least value, were only able to be part of the Ecclesia. However, it is important to notice that even being part of the Ecclesia gave you significant involvement in Athenian politics. You voted on basically all proposals put to you by the archons and the Boule, and you were heavily involved in all aspects of the running of the state. The Solonic constitution is represented here, and it shows the various interplay between the various aspects of society. One aspect we haven't talked about yet is the one that is sitting on the bottom left, which is called the Heliaia. The Heliaia was an offshoot of the Ecclesia. That is, this was the people who met as jurors or a law court for Athens. The Heliaia was headed by one of the Thesmothetae, and they made sure that they kept the justice system being administered. Solon also made a number of significant economic decisions. He realized that one of the problems that was facing Athens was that the rich were happy to export food to wherever they could make the most profit. This was meaning that food prices in Athens were going up significantly. And so Solon realized that a good idea was to make sure that foodstuffs could not be exported. So he proposed a strict export ban on all food. However, he realized he couldn't upset the wealthy landowners too much, and so he proposed that if they produced olives for oil, which was a valuable commodity at this time, used in all lamps and for lubrication, if they produced that, then that was fine. They were able to export that, and this was a very profitable commodity. It encouraged the rich to plant their land with olives, which was a high yield product. They also produced pottery, and with the pottery, they also produced grapes for wine. And so wines from Attica was allowed to be exported as well. Another high value product, leading to increased prosperity in Athens. That is, a farmer could afford to put away a little bit of his land for vines, that is grapevines or olive trees. The chances are he would probably move up one of the social rankings, so there was significant social mobility. At the end of this, Solon went and did something that was fairly unusual. He went into exile. This was voluntary exile for 10 years. Basically, he put it to the Areopagus, the Council of Elders, that it was important for people to experience the changes he'd made for 10 years, because without that, they would not possibly be able to know whether it was going to work or not. So consequently, Solon went off on an expedition, travelling around Greece, I think Egypt and Persia. But, unfortunately, his exile saw continued social disharmony. Political corruption continued, and it's very clear during this time that unfortunately, the great families continued fighting between one another, and the poor remained discontent. While Solon had thrown off their burdens, he had not resolved the issues that had led them to get into debt in the first place, and they continued to be unhappy. As a consequence, we were headed to a smackdown, rather like this one that is shown in the World Wrestling Federation.